So part one, the start of antibiotic use and resistance. On this slide, you see two pictures. The picture on your right is Miss Ann Miller, along with the Scottish researcher Alexander Fleming, who of course is credited with the discovery of penicillin in 1928. And most of you probably know the story of his accidental discovery, but the story doesn't stop there. So although Fleming stopped studying penicillin in 1931, his research was actually continued by two University of Oxford researchers, Howard Florey and Ernst Chain, and they are actually credited with the development of penicillin for use as a medication. Now, Miss Ann Miller is the first civilian patient to receive penicillin for treatment of an infection, but it's actually the gentleman on the left here, Albert Alexander, who is the first recipient of the Oxford penicillin on February 12, 1941. And Albert was a policeman in London, and there's conflicting stories on how he developed an infection. So he either scratched the side of his mouth while pruning roses or injured during a bombing raid. So pretty wide variation on how he got that infection, but nonetheless, he developed a life-threatening infection, and he was given penicillin. And within days, he made a remarkable recovery, but supplies of penicillin were limited and they ran out, and unfortunately, Albert died either a few days later or a few months later. Also before Mrs. Miller received her penicillin, we saw penicillin use in World War II, which helped reduce the number of deaths and amputations of troops during the war. And according to records, at the early months of the U.S. involvement in World War II, only about 400 million units of penicillin were available. By the end of the war, U.S. companies were making 650 billion units of penicillin a month. So this leads us back to Miss Ann Miller, who in March of 1942 was hospitalized at New Haven Hospital in Connecticut for sepsis due to a streptococcal infection from a miscarriage. She was successfully treated with penicillin and went on to live until she was 90 years old. Okay. So here's our first polling question, if you have that available to you. What exactly is antimicrobial resistance? Is it A, the body's resistance to antibiotics, B, bacteria that's resistant to soap, C, the ability of microorganisms to resist the effects of a drug, and I apologize for the typo there, and then, or D, when antibiotics no longer work. Okay, so everyone should have put C, and then I'm not sure from the AV team if there's a way I can bring up the poll results, probably on the iPad. I'm warming you guys up with an easy question. I'll challenge you on the next polling question a little bit more.
Okay.
So for each one, we'll see the results.
Okay. Thanks. So great, everyone passed. You guys got that one correct. So, antimicrobial resistance is the ability of an organism to resist the effects of a drug. And it doesn't mean your body is resistant. It simply means the organisms change over time and no longer respond to how we would expect them to respond, which makes it harder to treat infections. It leads to disease spread, significant illness, and in some cases, death. Antibiotic resistance can affect anyone of any age and in any country. Resistance occurs naturally, but misuse of antibiotics, not only in humans and animals, is affecting the process, and we're seeing increased and longer hospital stays, higher medical costs, and increased mortality. Okay, so how do microbes become resistant? It's because of evolution and natural selection. Each time living things reproduce, their genetic code mutates. Often these mutations have little impact on the next generation, but sometimes a mutation results in a survival advantage. In this case, the mutation results in the bacteria being unaffected by the drug that was used to kill its ancestors. That mutation allows a microbe to resist a drug. It multiplies, new mutations occur, and this process is repeated as new drugs are given, and next thing you know, voila, you have your microbes that are resistant to antibiotics and other drugs. Interesting fact, about 10% of us carry antibiotic resistance bacteria in our bodies. These resistant strains of bacteria can arise in several ways: spontaneously, through person-to-person transmission, and simply picking them up in the environment like a trip to the hospital, even if you're not a patient, you're just visiting a patient there. So here's another great picture of showing development of antibiotic resistant bacteria. You have a few number of the resistant strain, you give them an antibiotic, number of the resistant antibiotic multiply. Next thing you know, the most common population is that antibiotic resistant strain. Here you can see the evolution of a superbug. In this case, it's MRSA. So remember, it was developed and used extensively by the end of World War II and after World War II. So by 1950, half of the hospital strains as staff are resistant to penicillin. In the 1960s and 70s, resistance has now spread to the community. The first case of MRSA identified in the United Kingdom was in 1962, and in the United States it was 1968. And by the 1980s and 90s, penicillin resistance exceeds 80% in the community and 95% in the hospitals. I interspersed some cartoons in there. It's after lunch. Dr. Kelly Scott is a hard act to follow, so I'm spicing it up. This is probably my favorite cartoon out of all of them. It was on a shortcut through the hospital kitchens that Albert was first approached by a member of the antibiotic resistance. So, all right, part 2, current state of antibiotic resistance. And so here's your next polling question. All right, which group of antibiotic-resistant infections are increasing the fastest since 2013? Who's up to date on your pathology? All right, you guys are good. I've got almost a tie between A and B, so let's see. So the correct answer is A. Since 2013, we've seen a 315% increase in erythromycin-resistant invasive group A streptococcus, a 124% increase in drug-resistant gonorrhea, and a 50% increase in EBSL-producing Enterobacteriaceae. It's always fun to give a presentation during allergy season in North Texas. Okay. So the CDC came out with their first antibiotic-resistant threats in the United States report in 2013. The second one and latest one came out in 2019. And the good news is between those 2 years, the number of deaths from antibiotic-resistant infections has decreased, but the number of people facing antibiotic resistance is still high. Currently, there are more than 2.8 million antibiotic-resistant infections that occur in the U.S. each year. The antibiotic-resistant threat report focuses mainly on bacteria. They put them in a table that you see here called the problem pathogens, and they divide the pathogens into 4 groups based on 7 factors. So clinical impact, economic impact, incidence in the U.S., 10-year projection incidence, which includes international context, transmissibility, availability of effective antibiotics, and barriers to prevention. You can see the 4 threat levels. Urgent threats are the most serious, and are those that are requiring the most monitoring and prevention activities.